Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about logical fallacies for a little bit. All right. So, logical fallacies are an important thing. We need to be able to identify logical processes in the things we write and be able to see where we may not be making the proper connections. Also, we should be able to, in the sources we use, identify where there may be some logical breaks. Um, so, to start with, I want to explain exactly what logic is, right? Now, logic is reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity. These are rules for guiding reason in the absence of absolute knowledge. So essentially, all logic is basically having a pattern, um, a set guidance for determining where we should question the things that we are questioning. Is it making sense? That's what logic is. We normally view logic in this idea of the argument, that especially within the rhetorical sense that we are writing, that we want to consider these sorts of arguments. That an argument is a collection of statements, which are called premises, intended to support or infer a claim, which is called the conclusion. So each statement has a truth value. Each little statement in it says this is either true or false. If we have a statement that has a false value, that doesn't mean the conclusion is not necessarily true, but it does mean we have to question it, right? And the way that we normally see these like phrased is in what's called a conditional statement. If such and such is true, then this must also be true, right? So think about that as we go through this, right? For example, in Love is a Fallacy, if Petey has a raccoon coat, then he will be able to date Polly. That is a conditional statement that's present within that story. The first logical fallacy we want to look at, the first break in this sort of conditional and this truth value sort of formula, is what's called a dicto simpliciter. It is a general rule or observation that is treated as universally true regardless of the circumstances or the individuals concerned. This is also known as a sweeping generalization or an unqualified generalization. For example, in the photo here, people died of cancer before cigarettes were invented, so smoking doesn't cause cancer. Is this true? No, because people died of cancer from other causes, right? Um, this isn't an actual like sweeping statement, right? We also see if exercise is good, then everyone should exercise. We know that's not true because some people have underlying health conditions that can impact what happens when they exercise. There's a great episode of The Fresh Prince where Uncle Phil is prescribed exercise, but he goes out and has a heart attack while he's in the middle of exercise because his body couldn't handle the intensity at which he was exercising. So we know this isn't necessarily a true statement. It's good for the most part, but there are qualifying conditions. Another example of this is the hasty generalization. This is where we're applying a belief to a larger population than it should be based on the information that is available. This is where we're using anecdotal evidence to create a larger, or saying that something is true for everybody, like a stereotype, right? So the two weightlifters I have met both took steroids. Therefore, all weightlifters take steroids. Do all weightlifters take steroids? No. We can't base this off of just the fact that we knew one or two people, right? So when we think about personal experience can be helpful in developing a rhetorical argument, but we have to be careful and make sure that it is representative of the overall population, that's representative of a larger truth and experience. Another example is if someone has an allergic reaction to medication, then all people are allergic to that medication. This is not necessarily true, right? Just because one person is allergic to it doesn't mean everybody's allergic to it. It means that, certain people may have an allergy or an allergic reaction to that. Cherry picking is another type of logical fallacy. This is where we suppress evidence or we don't use all the evidence in order to point to something and create a truth, right? We see this all the time. We've talked a little bit about it this semester, that it's where we only use a couple of facts in order to draw a conclusion, even though there are other facts that point to that this may not be the actual case, right? We see this all the time. So whenever we get new information, We need to make sure we're incorporating it and changing our argument to incorporate that new evidence. Cherry picking often happens as a result of confirmation bias, that we are looking at something and saying, oh, this matches what I believe, so I'm going to believe this part of the evidence and not all of it. A false analogy is when a comparison is made between two ideas or objects that seemingly have similar characteristics, but the comparison does not hold up. In this case, in the picture here, we have a cat riding another cat. And the other picture, we have a space shuttle riding an airplane. A false analogy would be to say that cats can fly because they are configured similarly to the airplane. Is this true? No. At least no cats I know or that I've read about can fly. Equivocation or false equivalency is very similar to this. This is when we have a key phrase or a term that's used in an argument in a very ambiguous, in a very vague way, with one meaning in one portion of the argument, and then another meaning in another portion of the argument. So in this case, we have two hound dogs, so they must be equally favorites in this race. You know, since they're both hounds, they're meant for racing, right? Not quite. Clearly, one is not bred for that sort of function and will struggle more than the other hound dog in order to complete the race. A post hoc fallacy is where we say that where we use hindsight to draw a conclusion that might not be valid. Something happened in the past, and that means that this is what's happening right now. So I ate a loaf of bread and got a cold a few days later. So I must have gotten sick from the bread I ate. There could have been a lot of other reasons that you got sick. It didn't necessarily have to be the bread. This is where we talk about correlation not equaling causation. Just because two things happened doesn't mean that one thing caused the other. Hypothesis contrary to fact is another type of logical fallacy that we see often. This is the negative side of what we just saw with the post hoc. Well, if this had not happened, then this would not have happened. If I had not eaten that bread, then I would not be sick. In reality, there were probably a lot of things that could have caused you to be sick. The bread just it just happened to have happened, right? So if you had not eaten the bread, could you have still gotten sick? Yes. Contradictory premises are where we draw a conclusion from inconsistent or incompatible premises. For example, in Star Wars, only a Sith deals in absolutes. This is a phrase uttered by a Jedi, but the statement itself is an absolute. So is this Jedi his own enemy and a Sith because he's using an absolute phrase? Another example is the sign right here in the picture. No dogs, but beware dog on premises. Right? So if there are no dogs, how can we beware of the dog on the premises? These are two things that do not match. These contradict each other. The false dilemma is another example of a logical fallacy. It's where we falsely claim something to be either or. We also call this a false binary or a false dichotomy. There isn't always just two sides to something. That there's usually an actual spectrum, or there may be a third option or even a fourth option to the way that we can view things. When we look at presidential elections, we usually see Republican versus Democrat, but there are third parties, right? We present ourselves with two options when in reality there may be a third, fourth, fifth, sixth. This is an example. Another example is if you don't believe in going to college to make more money, then you shouldn't go to college. And reality is there's a lot of reasons to go to college. I went to college to become a writer. There's not a lot of money in writing. I did it because it's something I enjoy doing. It's something that completes me as a person. It's something that I'm good at. I'm not going to college to become a multimillionaire. So while for many people they can go to college and this could be their motivation, it isn't the case for everybody. So we need to avoid these sorts of false binaries and false dichotomies and false dilemmas and the things that we write. A straw man fallacy is something I believe we discussed a little bit already, right? So it's based on giving the impression of refuting an opponent's argument while actually refuting an argument that you basically made up. That, for example, there's a war on Christmas because some people prefer to say happy holidays. That's not exactly the case. No one is claiming a war on Christmas. They just want to maybe make other people feel more comfortable, um, who may not be Christian or maybe of another religion or atheist or so on. It doesn't mean that there's a war against Christmas, um, but people will make that argument because what they're doing is creating this straw man, this argument that doesn't actually exist in order to attack. Another one is what's called an appeal to ignorance. It's based on the assumption that a statement must be true if it cannot be proven false, or that it's false if it cannot be proven true. We also call this argumentum ad ignorantium in the argument from ignorance. For example, if you cannot prove that aliens are not real, then they clearly exist, right? So because you haven't proven to me that they're not real, that they must exist, right? You have no evidence otherwise. And this isn't necessarily true. It may just be something we don't know yet. False cause is another sort of thing. This is, again, plays in this idea of correlation not equaling causation. It goes back to that post hoc fallacy. Mistakenly attempting to establish a causal connection. For example, in this picture, the sales increase the longer this guy grows out his mustache. So clearly the mustache is responsible, right? We don't know. We need more evidence in order to establish an actual causal claim. The slippery slope fallacy is another one that we see all the time. It's where somebody says that a small step leads to a chain of events that create in some big, larger effect, right? So think about the snowball in a cartoon going downhill and getting bigger and bigger and, rolling over everybody. So, for example, if I don't take my dog for a walk today, then I will not take him for a walk ever again. And then he's going to get out of shape, and he'll get diabetes, and then he'll have to be put down. This is a slippery slope fallacy. Just because I don't take out my dog for a walk today doesn't mean I'm going to stop forever. I could do it tomorrow. I could do it the next day. So we have to think about these. These are things that we see constantly in the world around us. That if we do this, then this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. But we need to establish a greater causal connection, right? We can't just simply say, again, that this leads to this just because we see, we think there's a causal connection when there is none. Okay, circular arguments or begging the question is another common logical fallacy. It's where someone begins with what they are trying to end with. For example, in this lovely Dilbert cartoon, what is the key to success? Hire the right employees. Well, how do you know that you hired the right ones? Because the business is successful, right? So we're seeing this, well, if A is true, then B must be true. But in order for A to be true, B must also be true. We see this sometimes in what's called like a catch-22, which is, by the way, if you ever read Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, that's where the term comes from. And it's a brilliant piece of literature, one of the best books of the 20th century. But it's the idea that in the book he says, well, I would like to leave this place during World War II. I would like to go home from the war because I feel like I'm crazy. And the doctor says, well, how do you know you're crazy? Well, because clearly I'm coming to you. Well, if you're coming to me knowing that you're crazy, then clearly you're not crazy because you can identify that you're crazy, right? So it becomes a catch-22. In order to get sent home for being crazy, he has to be able to identify that he's crazy and therefore can't be crazy. This is a circular reasoning. This is begging the question. This is coming back and using the one thing or the second premise to certify the first premise. Ad hominems are another thing we see constantly, especially if you watch the news around politics. It's where we attack the character or circumstances of an individual who is advancing a statement or argument instead of seeking to disprove the truth of the statement or the soundness of the argument, right? For example, if you have ever been to jail, then you cannot criticize the police. We know this is not necessarily the case. We understand that that people have an argument whether or not they've been to jail or not. Um, this is saying something. It's essentially you're not addressing the argument that's being made. You're addressing that person, regardless of someone's background. The argument they are making could be absolutely true. So we need to make sure that we're addressing an argument and not the person. Poisoning the well is another type of logical fallacy that we see all the time. It's irrelevant, adverse information about a target that's given to the audience with the intention of discrediting or ridiculing someone before they say it. So anyone who disagrees with me about education clearly hates children, right? It's another way of using like a sort of ad hominem. Well, you clearly hate children, and that's why anyone who doesn't want a certain kind of testing must hate children. This has nothing to do with whether or not this particular type of testing works, but you're poisoning the well. You're saying this so when people see the actual argument, they're like, well, no, well, we got to back that up because you clearly hate children. So we need to think about these sorts of things. Red herring is another example of this, right? Where we're misleading or distracting from the relevant or important question. This is where we use what's called a whataboutism. Sure, I might have committed fraud, but so did my sister, and she was not placed on trial or convicted. My sister is a wonderful lady. She would never commit fraud. But the point is that, this is where we're saying, but what about what they did? That over here, pay attention to that, and don't pay attention to this actual thing, the actual argument that's occurring. A to quote or an appeal to hypocrisy is another one that we see constantly. We're attempting to discredit an opponent's argument by asserting that the opponent's failure to act consistently is in accordance with the conclusion. So if you drive a truck, then you cannot have a solution to climate change because trucks are bad. But you can still own a truck and still understand here's a way to think about climate change. We can still have an argument that's true and valid, if despite not necessarily adhering to that principle in our own lives, right? So we need to think about that. We need to think about the argument itself and not the person presenting the argument. And ad misericordium is another one that we see all the time. This is what we call an appeal to emotion, right? So while we have, appeal to emotion or pathos as one of our rhetorical appeals, it is also a logical fallacy at some level, right? That we're saying, pay attention to this, especially to like misery or pity. For example, you can't convict this man of murder. He's an orphan, right? We're not paying attention to the logic. We're still, he can still be in murder whether he's an orphan or not, right? That's what's happening, in this picture. So when we're using our pathos, and we're using our appeal to emotion, we need to make sure that we're still backed up logically in our argument, that we're not diving so hard into the pathos that we are forgetting to have a sound logic behind what we say. Fallacy of sunk cost is an economic one. It's that a cost has already been incurred, cannot be recovered. So if I pay my employees and I have lost money, you haven't lost money. You're rewarding your employees. You're incentivizing them, things like that. So the money isn't lost. It's just become something else. So it's the idea that whatever you put into it is now lost, that it doesn't become transformed or transfer into something else. An appeal to authority is one, again, that we see constantly that we need to question. It's the thing that I always tell you, right? If you believe something must be true because believed by someone who's said to be an authority on the subject. So I am a published writer. I know everything about writing. Is that the case? No, I'm still learning. We're all still learning. Hemingway was still learning up until he was winning a Nobel, still talking about how he was still learning about things to write. Whenever we read these articles, we can't take them to be we understand them to be an authority. We understand their ethos, but we also have to question them because we need to look at the argument being made and not just take somebody on their word. The Izzat fallacy is the assumption that because something is a certain way, it must be that way. If I paid off my student loans, then you should have to pay off your student loans. This is what's called an Izzat fallacy. Just because this exists in this way doesn't mean it always has to be that way. things can change. We can find new ideas, new principles. And the reverse of that is the ought is. This is the way things are, or this is the way I want them to be, and that must be the way that they should be, right? This is just by confirmation of bias, right? Wishful thinking. If I believe the world is flat, then the world is flat. Just because you think something and without like facts or information doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, right? So we need to make sure that we're looking at the actual evidence and logic behind an argument. And of course, the bandwagon fallacy. Just because everybody says it doesn't mean that it's true. The opinion of the majority is not always valid, that we have to be able to sort and understand things on our own. Right? So again, just think about how the ways in which we can avoid logical fallacies. Clearly, what has become a running theme is one, think about the argument being made, not who's making it, not, we need to focus on what's happening in the argument, right? And then we need to make sure that we're developing a causal connection, that we're not just saying these two things exist, but this leads to this, and we can prove that this leads to this, right? So remember that. Think about the ways in which we can avoid logical fallacies, and it's going to improve your writing and improve your ability to critique those things that you read. So just something to kind of think about, right? Logical fallacies are an important part of what we read and what we write. So make sure that you're paying attention to these as you read and write.